Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Makwariola. Often called the smiling coast of West Africa, with sun-kissed beaches and exotic places, Africa heaved a sigh of relief about 2 years ago when Gambians finally got her groove back in a once repressed country. For the first time since independence from Britain in 1965, power changed hands in Africa's smallest nation when the people of Gambia threw out the man who had ruled them for 22 years, showing that even the most entrenched African leader can be defeated at the ballot. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on political and the socio-economic developments in the Gambia almost 2 years after the ouster of former dictator Yahya Jammeh? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report in Africa Today. We'll be right back. Welcome.
Britain's Prince of Wales and the Duchess of Cornwall recently visited the Gambia to celebrate the country's return to the Commonwealth after former dictator Yahya Jammeh went into exile. It was the first time the Prince of Wales is visiting Gambia since the Commonwealth leaders voted unanimously last year, April, that he should succeed the Queen as head of the Commonwealth. Britain's Prince Charles congratulated Gambia for turning its back on autocratic rule at home and returning to the Commonwealth fold as he began a 9-day Africa tour. The West African former British colony rejoined the Commonwealth in February, 5 years after its now exiled authoritarian former leader Yahya Jammeh pulled Gambia out, dubbing the 54-member group a neo-colonial institution. Jammeh, who fled Gambia last year after regional militaries launched an operation to remove him, repeatedly clashed with the British authorities over criticism of his government's human rights record. Under Jammeh's 23-year rule, the country gained a reputation as a repressive state where journalists and political opponents were jailed, tortured, and even murdered. President Adama Barrow, who won a December 2016 election that Jammeh rejected, is attempting to rehabilitate Gambia's image abroad. Critics of the Commonwealth see it as an outdated relic of Britain's imperial past, while advocates say it gives small countries like Gambia a seat at the table with larger states and has potential to improve life for its 2.4 billion residents.
Welcome back. Before we get into the discussion of the day, let's update you on some stories around Africa. Mozambique has appointed 3 top commanders of Renamo, the country's largest opposition party and former rebel movement, to key army positions as part of peace-building efforts. Egypt has warned it will take legal action against Apple if the United States tech giant fails to remove alleged restrictions on local distributors within 60 days. After 4 years working interviewing almost 50,000 witnesses, Tunisia's commission tasked with serving justice to victims of 50 years of dictatorship is poised to submit its recommendations. And now joining me to look at the political and socio-economic developments in the Gambia are 2 Gambian journalists here at our studios, Mustafa Mbeye and Abdullahi Say. Both of them work with the Gambia radio and television services. Good to have you both on the program tonight.
Thank you for having us.
It's an honor.
Now let me begin with you now, Mustafa. Let's begin with your experiences so far as a Gambian journalist. Tell us what it was like under Yahya Jammeh.
Thank you, Esther. To sum it up, it was difficult for us journalists during the Jammeh administration days. Now, the reason for this was that, during Yahya Jammeh's era as President of the Republic of the Gambia, there were several laws that were brought into our law books in the Constitution, to be more specific, that barred journalists from doing their job. And these laws include sedition, criminal defamation and you know, libel laws. So as a matter of fact, we Gambian journalists find it very, very difficult to execute our mandate as expected by the general populace of the Gambia.
And Abdullahi, was it the same with you because you worked together in the same station as well?
Absolutely. Just as he said, in the Gambia for 22 years, young journalists like me who were born shortly before Yahya Jammeh came to power, and we grew up in a system that was so repressive, so we barely knew democracy as it were. We joined the media while Jammeh was still in power, knowing very well that the stakes were very high. We also knew that everything was under the control of the former president Yahya Jammeh. Of course, it was very difficult for us to practice as journalists because you know very well, even though we work for the state broadcaster, we were limited in what we could write, we were limited in what we could say within and outside the office. So it was a tight environment for journalists. We barely had the space to practice our work.
And talking about experiences so far, Abdullahi, what other instances can you tell us, the harsh experiences you witnessed rather, under Yahya Jammeh's rule?
I think for my case, it's barely nothing. I've had difficult experiences, of course, but judging by the wider scope, the repressive nature of the regime and what journalists in the Gambia have suffered, my case is very small. I mean, in the December 2016 presidential election, of course, if you've been following Gambian politics, you know it was very tense. Now, when we decided enough was enough as journalists, we, even at the state broadcast, we were resolved, or we were committed to making sure we serve our nation. Now, in the process, we faced a lot of challenges. Personally, like I remember, there was this day, it was during the political impasse, I decided that, you know, I have to go against the former president because I would rather serve my nation. Now, an instance where the Nigerian National Assembly was debating whether to grant Yahya Jammeh asylum or not. It was considered as unthinkable to broadcast it on the state broadcaster, but I thought it's something that people should know because everyone was leaving the country. People barely knew what was happening, so information about the country was coming from outside the country because we couldn't deliver the information that people needed to know. So we decided it's enough, so we went ahead and broadcast this story. When we broke this story, I can remember because we have a bulletin, the English version runs first, then you have local languages. So the local language was barely on air when it was stopped. So they came, the minister, the former Minister of Information came with a security entourage, and they wanted to round up, the editor, of course, which was me and my colleague, Mustafa. I think, but in terms of the general perspective, that's just a small case regarding what journalists in the Gambia have really faced. Really?
Small case, you call it? Wow. Now, Mustafa, right now, there is a new system of government under Adama Barrow, and he promised a change for the Gambians. Would you say that that change is resonating in the media right now?
Yes, to a large extent, I would say yes. The change is resonating for the fact that the Gambia Press Union, which is the umbrella body of all journalists working in the Gambia, where I also work as the head of the Ethics and the Disciplinary Committee, went to court in 2014. This was during Jammeh's time, to challenge some of the harsh laws that I mentioned earlier. And at that time, unfortunately, the Supreme Court had no judges because for some reason, Jammeh decided to relieve the judges of their, from their position. So the cases were pending, but in May this year, the Supreme Court ruled that, those laws are unconstitutional, and as a matter of fact, had to be removed from our law books, and this is a great step towards freedom of the press in the Gambia. Right. Just to clarify that the law on sedition, of course, has the Supreme Court's ruling states that in the person of the president, it still remains though, and we are fighting to see that, the Supreme Court, change its decision on that. So still now, that is unfortunate, but to a large extent, when it applies to other government officials, the sedition laws on sedition have been removed from our
Okay,
books.
pause for a minute, because I'm trying to understand that area you just mentioned. Now, what exactly is it you're talking about that hasn't changed? Is it the law that favors the present government, or the law that favored both the present government and the past government? What exactly are you trying to put out here?
Now, the laws were criminal defamation laws and false news on the internet, which meant a mere post on Instagram or on Facebook or Twitter could lead you to jail. Now, these are the laws that the Supreme Court declared in May this year that they are unconstitutional. And we also, I mean, this law on sedition, the Supreme Court ruled that if it involves government officials, it is unconstitutional, but in the person of the president, it is still constitutional. Yes.
So that means it's still the same?
It's still there.
Okay, but right now, your country should experience some level of change in terms of new media stations springing up, I believe, private media stations as against what it was practiced under Yahya Jammeh. Would you say the private stations in the Gambia have to face this kind of rules or laws that govern their practice?
What I would describe in general, the private stations, of course, there are several TV stations have been given license to operate in the Gambia, and as well as many radio stations. Now, the Gambia government promised during the government of President Adama Barrow, of course, during the campaign, they promised that they are going to ensure that press freedom was provided for in the Gambia. But the radio stations now and before are totally different, because before, all what they broadcast, mainly 80% of their broadcast was on sports. And I mean, no radio station there talk about politics because the next minute it would be closed. That was during Jammeh's era. Okay. They would shut down the radio station and the journalists would be arrested and detained, tortured. Of course, these have been a norm in the Gambia at the time. Now, that is not happening now. During the past 2 years since the government of Adama Barrow came to power, journalists are not being harassed. Nonetheless, there are laws that can be used against them, and this is what we at the Gambia Press Union are still fighting to ensure that no one is caught in the web.
Right, let's quickly go on a very quick break. Now you're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at the social and political developments in the Gambia. We'll have more in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back. Now, life after office took a new dimension for former Gambian President Yahya Jammeh when the United States State Department barred him and members of his immediate family from entering the United States. Now, the decision came almost 2 years after Jammeh was forced into exile in Equatorial Guinea when he refused to concede defeat in a presidential election that has left the country still divided along ethnic lines. Now, Abdullahi, let's look at the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission since the ouster of Yahya Jammeh. How would you react? How would you describe their efforts so far?
Yeah, I think they're doing really great as of now. Of course, there have been people who've been saying the TRRC, the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commissions, coming into being or starting of work has been delayed. There have been people who've been questioning their commitment. But I think overall they've done a great job so far, because we understand that hearings would start in January, the first week of January. Hearings will start. Of course, they have gathered a list, according to the Executive Secretary, a list of many people, witnesses who have agreed to come and testify before the Commission. They've also made wide consultations across the country. They've also trained many people. They've trained journalists, editors, and of course people who are very crucial in the healing process, such as community leaders, traditional communicators, and youth groups. So in terms of the preparations, I think the ground is very set. When the Commission begins work, I think it's going to be such an interesting episode in the Gambia's history.
Now, Mustafa, from his own perspective, do you think perhaps that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has done enough for the victims who have been looking for justice since, you know, they've had their rights abused, they've had their family members killed? Do you think they've found the justice that they so desire?
Yeah, as of now, I would say that they are on course to, of course, achieving that. Let's not forget that the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission began hearings just a couple of weeks ago, or in days. And prior to that, of course, there are these funding issues. Just to add on to what my colleague Abdullah said, the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission was set up by an Act of Parliament. Of course, everyone knows what happened in the Gambia during the past 22 years under Jammeh's rule. There were human rights violations that needed to be addressed. And that's hence the setting up of this Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission. Now, according to the chairperson of the TRRC, who is a former Gambian journalist, Dr. Baba Gale Jallow, the TRRC in the Gambia is different from previous TRRCs in other countries because, of course, they made study tours in Sierra Leone, in Rwanda, and other countries. And one of the things that he said was a setback to some of those countries that he learned was the time that it has taken to pay reparations. And as a matter of fact, that has been changed in this one, because as it progresses, payments or reparations are paid. So they don't, in essence, they don't wait until the end of the commission to start paying reparations, because he, in his own words, there are victims who needed medical treatment, there are victims who are already losing out at school that, yes, needed to be addressed. So in essence, obviously they are on course to addressing, yes.
Now, one of the tasks of the commission is to extradite and perhaps prosecute Yahya Jammeh for the human rights violations which were carried out under his watch. How feasible is that?
Now, the TRRC, based on the act that set it up, has a high court status, the status of a high court. And in addition to the TRRC, of course, there are human rights activists both in the Gambia and abroad who are also, of course, calling for Jammeh to be tried. And not only calling, but they are also doing a lot of effort in ensuring that Jammeh is tried. And of course, these efforts are going, well, they are being heard, but I would say that not anytime soon. If Jammeh is to be, yes.
Not anytime soon. So
no.
Why are you so skeptical? Why that that thought?
I think one of the reasons is, of course, the ECOWAS agreement that led to Jammeh being sent into exile to Equatorial Guinea is still not very clear to Gambians. And a few months ago, the president of Equatorial Guinea did say on France 24 that, you know, part of the agreement that, you know, allowed Jammeh to stay in his country is that he is not to be extradited to be tried. So all these are things that are still not clear to Gambians on what condition is Jammeh at Equatorial Guinea. What was signed, still now, these are things that needed to be clarified to Gambians.
Okay, Abdullah, let's look at the future of Gambia now. Since Adama Barrow took office, he promised a better future for the Gambians. How would you assess his performance so far? And what areas do you think needs critical improvement?
Yeah, I think first we have to understand that Adama Barrow came to power very roughly, I would describe it, because of the political impasse, and he was leading a coalition that was not really prepared to take power. Now, when he came to office, he faced a lot of challenges in terms of establishing his cabinet, in terms of getting the system running. It was very difficult for him. But since he took over, since he settled down, he had achieved a lot in terms of freedom of expression, fundamental human rights. Now, the Gambia is ranked among the biggest mover in the global index of freedom of expression and media freedom by Article 19 in its 2017 and 2018 report. So in terms of freedom of expression, the fundamental human rights of people, I think he has done great. But I think there are still challenges in terms of the livelihoods of the people, youth empowerment especially. Now, Gambia is one of the biggest suppliers, I will call it, of illegal migrants or irregular migrants to Europe. We have many Gambians who live in the country to go to Europe via the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea. That has reduced since he came to power. But the level of frustration among young people is still persistent. People see him as somebody who's really focused on delivering good governance, but in terms of pragmatism, there is still a lot of way to go. And of course, the agriculture sector too is quite a useful sector, is one of the highest employers in the country, but still there are challenges. Still there are farmers who cultivate their crops. At the end of the season, they cannot get a good market price. Others who sell their crops to the government find it difficult to get their money back.
Now, Abdullah, in the areas of political development, would you say that Adama Barrow has performed creditably well compared to the rule under Yahya Jammeh?
Yeah, I think in the 2 years he has served, about 2 years he has served so far, I think he has outperformed Yahya Jammeh's 22 years in terms of political inclusion, in terms of especially participation. Now we see a lot of young people actively taking part in politics. We have seen young people contesting, and we have seen in the Gambia a youth council of about 22 years. That has never happened in Yahya Jammeh's 22 years in power. And of course in the National Assembly too, Gambia has one of the most diverse National Assembly presently in its history. So in terms of participation in politics, many Gambians are now daring to come forward. Young people are coming forward, women also coming forward, participating in politics without fear of retribution, fear of harassment. So the space has been widened, it has been broadened because everybody feels that the democracy has been opened up, everybody's part of the national agenda. So in terms of good governance and participatory democracy, he has really outperformed Yahya Jammeh and his entire tenure, that's 22 years.
Now, Mustafa, do you share the same sentiments, or there's a contrary view in this?
Indeed, I share the same sentiments, because when we talk about the politics in the Gambia now, as my colleague Abdullah mentioned, of course, everyone is involved in politics now, unlike during Jammeh's days. Coming back to the issue of performance, indeed, there are a lot of areas that the government of President Adama Barrow needs to improve.
And what could that be?
The health sector,
right,
is one, because actually there doesn't seem to be any change from the status quo. And of course, this is something that Gambians expected, that it wouldn't be long when this government would work out the issue of health. Coming to employment, youth employment, the draft budget has just been released 2 weeks ago to Parliament, and of course it was so surprising that what was allocated to youth and sports what was allocated to defense is almost 7 to 8 times what is allocated to youth and sports. And this is something that everyone is criticizing his government for. On the agriculture sector, equally the same. Gambia doesn't have mechanized agriculture, and 70% of the rural population relies on agriculture. And Gambians expected that this government is going to at least do something to improve the agriculture sector.
But it is just 2 years, perhaps. There's something in the offing in the next 1 year or so before the next election, don't you think?
Yes, maybe, but it is a priority, and it is very urgent. And we haven't seen much being prepared, the ground being prepared for such. And of course, we believe that that should have been one of the most urgent interventions that this government should have
focused on.
Yeah.
Now, before we let you go, now, we know you've been in Nigeria for about 10 weeks now. So I want you to tell us a bit of your experience in Nigeria. What has it been like for you?
Yeah, it has been a wonderful experience. And in a sense, it has been also a surprise, because as a journalist, I've covered issues about Nigeria, I've read issues about Nigeria, I've listened to issues about Nigeria. But most of the things that I heard on the mainstream media were negative stories about Nigeria. And this is not exactly what I find, such as the war, the Boko Haram issue, the Al-Qaeda in the north, and you know, issues of drug dealing, issues of
so all that is different for you right now.
Yes, for the 10 weeks that I've been here, it's the opposite that I found here.
And Mustafa, do you share the same thoughts as well? Oh, Abdullahi, I'm so sorry, Abdullahi.
Yeah, I think I share similar thoughts. I've really been having quite impressive views about Nigeria. I was here in 2016 briefly, and I couldn't have the chance to meet many Nigerians and get to know the nitty-gritties of the socio-political aspects of the country. But in the 10 weeks I've spent here, I realized that Nigeria is indeed the country that I thought it was. But then, as Mustafa said, there are many misconceptions outside there about the country. You know, if you travel across the world, of course, probably in the Gambia, there are people who are very close to Nigerians, have a lot of Nigerians there, so we have a bit of an idea of what Nigeria is.
All right.
But outside that...
Well, we're really out of time.
Yeah,
thank you very much, Abdullahi, for your thoughts, and as well, Mustafa, we thank you, both Gambian journalists here with us in Nigeria. Thank you for your time and your analysis on Africa Today.
Thanks for having us.
2 years ago saw the end of a political era in the Gambia when Africa witnessed what has been one of the continent's biggest step towards democracy in recent times. Now the destiny of Africa's smallest nation remains on the shoulders of President Adama Barrow, who needs to effectively correct the leadership mistakes of the past to broaden the country's horizon of hope for the future. And that is our package for tonight. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG, and follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one again, I am Esther Mokwariola, and always remember, Africa can only get better.